As one of the first bands to emerge from the San Francisco music scene in 1965, Jefferson Airplane helped lead a music renaissance that saw the shift in music go from the British invasion to San Francisco. And although they get lumped in with the likes of the Grateful Dead, Quicksilver Messenger Service, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and the Charlatans, purveyors of the so-called San Francisco sound, Jefferson Airplane was much different than their loose contemporaries. They were brash, arrogant, uncompromising, and they pushed the boundaries of music to the limit. And we're going to chart their course here on Pop Goes the 60s. Jefferson Airplane's an important band because they really helped move rock music into the direction that was much heavier, less conventional, and way more rebellious. And their sexually suggestive and drug-inspired lyrics combined with radical left-wing politics put them on the cutting edge artistically, politically, and musically. The beginnings of the Jefferson Airplane can be traced to March of 1965 when Marty Balin met Paul Kantner at the Drinking Gourd, which is a local folk club in San Francisco. Now, Marty Balin had been... He had recorded a single, was being groomed as a pop star. That didn't work out. He formed the Town Criers, which was a folk group. Meanwhile, San Francisco native Paul Kantner had been playing with a guy named David Freiberg and had lived with David Crosby, who by this time in 1965 was a Byrd. So Paul and Marty got together and they started putting pieces together for their band. Wanted to add a female voice to the mix, they picked up Signe Anderson, who was also a performer at the Drinking Gourd, and she had a real powerhouse voice. She could do blues, she could do folk, and so she was a great addition. Then they added bass player Bob Harvey and drummer Jerry Peliquin, and before you know it, they had themselves a group. So the group started rehearsing, and while this was going on, Marty Balin approached 3 potential investors to buy a club together. Now there's this pizza joint that was for sale, and they ended up buying this with the intention of opening up a club for musicians to play because there was a lot of bands popping up at the time and not a lot of venues. So this was going to be the Matrix. Marty had a 25% stake in the business. The other investors involved were able to front the band some money for new instruments. Now they felt something was missing as they were rehearsing, and what was missing was a really fine guitar player. Paul was a decent rhythm player, and Marty mostly was acoustic player, but they were both rhythm guys. They weren't really lead guitar players. And help arrived when a guy living upstairs of Marty was teaching another guy guitar, and that was Jorma Kaukonen, and he became the new guitar player. Jorma had a blues background and had been playing with budding singer Janis Joplin, and he had known Paul Kantner at Santa Clara University. So originally Paul thought that Jorma wouldn't want to play with them because he was a pretty good player, but Jorma was happy to join. So he came up with the name Jefferson Airplane as well. So his buddy Steve Talbot had kind of a name for Jorma. It was called Blind Thomas Jefferson Airplane. I think it was kind of a riff on Blind Lemon Jefferson. So they just took the Jefferson Airplane part and that became the band name. Now musicians in San Francisco at this time started experimenting with drugs. What was to become this hippie movement, which was an outgrowth from the Beat Poets, was pretty prominent in San Francisco. So there was not a lot of places for people to gather. And what happened was this particular venue that Marty Balin bought, he thought this would be perfect for a band to be basically the house band. So there was some intense rehearsals that took place because they had to be ready for the opening of the Matrix. And on August 13th, Jefferson Airplane opened to a packed house at the Matrix. In 1965 in San Francisco, part of forming a band was getting together with people that you had things in common with. And one of the things in common was the taking of drugs, which was a newer thing. And by 1964, Paul Kantner had already tried LSD, and they were smoking marijuana. So that was becoming part of this new culture. It wasn't long after they first started where they had their first defection. That was drummer Jerry Peliquin. And he, as I said earlier, you kind of had to be on the bus with the rest of the band, and I don't think he was, so he quit. So Marty Balin found another guy that he knew, or he had seen around, and that was Skip Spence. And Spence he really wasn't a drummer. Contrary to popular belief that he never had played drums before, that's completely untrue. Spence actually played drums in some rock and roll bands in high school and also played a snare drum, but he was really a singer-guitarist. But he jumped at the chance. He was looking to join a band, and as I said, there was this vibe around and bands were starting to form. As the new group began to gel, Harvey's bass playing came into question. He was playing a stand-up bass, and they had him switch to electric bass guitar, but that didn't really work, so they fired him. And originally they were going to bring in Jorma's brother Peter. That was frowned upon by Peter and Jorma's parents. They didn't want another son in a rock band. So Jorma reached out to an old Washington, D.C. buddy, Jack Cassidy. And Cassidy was an acoustic blues player, hadn't really played much bass before, and Jorma went out on a limb to get him in the band here, but turned out he was a great player, and he was accepted right away. Things in San Francisco began buzzing, and there was this energy passing between the performers and musicians that didn't go unnoticed by wannabe manager Matthew Cates. Matthew Cates was really interested in managing Jefferson Airplane, and they were impressed initially because he was kind of flamboyant. He was somewhat of an entrepreneur, and so they took him on as kind of an interim basis, and he immediately improved their look, got them some new clothes and got them some better instruments, and he connected them with some media types that came to their shows and things like that. He also promoted the slogan, "The Jefferson Airplane Loves You," and this started showing up on bumper stickers and buttons across town. And he didn't want their style to be called folk rock. That was the buzzword at the time. He wanted to call it folk jazz. Now, they didn't really play jazz, but they did play something different, and he was onto something when he wanted to set it apart from folk rock. Now, he wanted to sign a deal with them right away, but they were reluctant, and they put that off a while. They wanted to just do a handshake deal with Cates. Now, Matthew Cates came into the band really through Marty Balin, who knew him through his former group called the Town Criers. And another one of Marty's friends, Bill Thompson, became a band assistant and confidant and assumed some managerial duties even at this early time and somewhat kept Matthew Cates at bay. The Matrix opening was a rousing success. The band started to build a very quick following. Now, some of their live shows, some Kantner and Balin originals started working their way into the sets, and Anderson's powerful voice complemented Balin and Kantner's voices for a very unique three-part harmony. Constant gigging solidified the playing of the rhythm section as Kaukonen and Cassidy really started to gel together. The growing Bay Area music scene began to move more in a rock direction that required more multimedia type of shows, and that was becoming the trend. And one of the shows that happened around in October of '65 was the tribute to Dr. Strange, which was at the Longshoremen's Hall. And that was attended by about 1,000 people. Nobody expected that many people. Jefferson Airplane headlined that show, also playing were the Marbles, the Charlatans, and the Great Society. And these shows, people would come dressed in costume, Old West gear, flowing dresses, and riverboat gamblers. Now, 3 months later, a much larger psychedelic event took place at the same venue called the Trips Festival. This was in January of '66. And this was a sold-out show. It was like over 6,000 people, and the punch was spiked with LSD. And this was one of the very first times where you had a very intense light show, and it was a landmark moment in the development of the hippie movement in these multimedia shows that started getting popular. Bill Thompson was friendly with a lot of different music writers, and he was instrumental in getting them to come to shows and review them. And one of the most notable ones was Ralph Gleason, a noted jazz critic, who came and wrote about the airplane. And this really heightened the credibility of the band. And Bill Thompson, who at this time didn't really have a title, I guess I would call him assistant manager, but he was really instrumental in helping get the right people to come to these shows. Now, although the Jefferson Airplane was relatively unknown outside of San Francisco, all this positive press started to get the attention of some record companies. And not just record companies, but also Phil Spector. And they went down to Los Angeles to audition for him. But that didn't go very well. Not many rock bands end up having a fruitful association with Phil Spector. I may do a video on that topic alone. But Cates had lined up several other auditions as well, since they were already in Los Angeles, with labels like Capitol, Valiant, Cold Gems, Fantasy, Elektra, and London. Now, they also did a demo for Columbia, but that didn't amount to anything, and they were not signed. Now, although Matthew Cates was doing some legwork in getting the band auditions, there was still no formal agreement between him and the band. And they had been with him long enough now, their collective spidey senses were tingling, and they didn't really want to sign a deal with this guy, preferring a handshake deal. Now, Cates was able to negotiate an amazing $25,000 advance from RCA Victor, and he used this as leverage to get the band to sign with him. So the band was really excited about this. And what he did was he lied to the band, telling them that they had to have a signed management deal for the record company to sign them. And the band, they were really hungry to get to the next level. The only problem is that Signe would not sign. She actually read the contract and said, this is a really bad deal. But the band really, they were furious with her because they wanted to get to that next level, and the peer pressure caused her to sign, and it was a deal they would soon regret. Now, the band didn't find out till later that Columbia would have signed them without a management deal with Cates. And one of the things that this management deal did do was it's cut Cates in for a very big part of the band's publishing going forward. So with that out of the way, at least they could start recording their first song.
I touch you. It's all right with me now.
Out of the 5 songs they recorded, they chose Marty Ballin's It's No Secret to be their first single. One of the great early songs, it sports a spot-on intro by drummer Skip Spence. Now this song, I just love this song, and it really shows how folk rock was developing into something new. Now the group reconvened in Los Angeles after the single went out. It didn't chart, by the way, but they started to record a proper album with producer Tommy Oliver. In addition to Tommy Oliver's production, Dave Hassinger was the engineer on this record. And the great thing about this album is there's quite a lot of Kantner and Ballin originals that range from folk rock to romantic ballads.
Oh, let me in, baby. You're driving me crazy. You're playing games. 'Cause you're so much younger than I am. Come up the years, come up the years.
The 3 distinct voices make for some ropey harmonizing because Kantner wasn't the strongest singer, but very unique harmonizing of the 3. Now the standout instrumentalist on this album is easily Jack Cassidy, and his groundbreaking bass playing is evident throughout this album, noticeably on the song Run Around, where his bass playing lurks in the background like a menacing shadow. Originally influenced by Bird Roger McGuinn, Jorma Kaukonen's playing was very acidy at this point, and he would take it to another level on the next album. But on this album, I would say the dominance really belongs to Marty Ballin, who wrote most of the songs and has most of the lead vocals, including the dark and sullen Blues from an Airplane.
You know how sad it is to be a man alone. Will come and some will go. We shall surely find.
That last song was an early reading of Dino Valente's Let's Get Together, and the Airplane was the second band to record that. The We Five had a minor hit with it earlier in 1965. There were also 3 songs that were censored due to either drug-inspired lyrics or sexually suggestive lyrics.
The nights I've spent with you have been fantastic trips. Well, I've seen you in 1,000 dreams.
The first one being Running Around This World, and the line in question was, "The nights I've spent with you have been fantastic trips." Though it was released as a B-side originally, they just pulled that off the album after a first pressing. The next song that got some censorship was called Let Me In. And this was somewhat sexually explicit, I guess, in the eyes of the record company anyway. And they took out the line, "I gotta get in, you know where," and they changed that to "You shut your door, now it ain't fair."
I gotta get in, you know where. You shut your door, now it ain't there.
And finally in the song Run Around, the original lyric that went, "Blinded by colors come flashing from flowers that sway as you lay below me," that was changed to "That sway as you stay here by me."
Blinded by colors come flashing from flowers that sway as you lay under.
stay here by me. Slow down.
Now, all of these changes in the censorship here rendered a couple different versions of this album. I'll talk about this in a minute. But the first version that came out had 12 tracks that included Run Around This World. And there was two other pressings. One was with 11 tracks omitting that song, with the other songs that weren't censored, and then a third issue with the rest of the songs I mentioned on here censored. And there are several different variations. All those are worth quite a lot of money. But this is not one of those. This is only with 11 tracks. It's the regular version. And this album it came out in, I think, late summer of '66. And although this was still in the folk rock period, it was just coming out of that. This was much darker than the folk rock that was going on at the time. And the writing of Cantner and Balin really displayed a more mature subject matter. Obviously, the sexual stuff was something you didn't hear in Gary Lewis and the Playboys. So this album was really bought by Californians because the band really hadn't been out of California hardly at all. And it climbed up to number 128 on the charts, which is pretty good for essentially a regional band. And they got very good reviews, and by the end of the year, it started picking up more sales. Now, the censored tracks that I played before I got these out of sequence here. Give me a moment here, ladies and gentlemen. How is it? This was released much later, but some of those early censored songs can be found on Early Flight. This came out in 1974. More on this album later. I think Jefferson Airplane takes off as one of the best albums in pop and rock in 1966. And on the back, they're kind of hyping this Jet Age sound, so it was kind of a new sound. And Ralph Gleason of the San Francisco Chronicle did the liner notes on this. So it garnered very good reviews. And but they had some problems after it was recorded because their drummer, Skip Spence, disappeared to Mexico. They didn't know where he was, so they fired him. Now, he had become a little bit unpredictable since starting to take LSD. This is one of those people that it didn't always jive really well with, and he couldn't be counted on, so they dumped him. The drummer they got in his place was a guy named Spencer Dryden, and he was in a Los Angeles band called The Ashes, which was a folk rock band, which was the precursor to Peanut Butter Conspiracy. And he left that group to join Jefferson Airplane. And he had crossed paths with them before because they were recording at RCA Studios when the Airplane was recording their album down there. So initially, he maybe didn't seem like the right fit because his background was a little more jazz. And really the Airplane sound on here, it's pretty much blues rock. It's more of a straight rock sound. This jazz kind of thing is really not a part of the sound, but Dryden's quiet type of jazz-style drumming really started to benefit the band and add some really unique textures to their sound. As Jefferson Airplane's stock began to grow among the youth of San Francisco, the hippie movement was well underway, and promoters like Chet Helms and Bill Graham started to book events into their ballrooms, the Avalon and the Fillmore, as demand for new psychedelic bands grew. Now, while the Jefferson Airplane was becoming the talk of the town, they realized that their manager, Matthew Cates, had to go. One of the main reasons was that he was not well liked in the industry by promoters or writers. He was always butting heads with them, and he was an odd guy. He would dress in these capes and the top hats, and he thought, I don't know if he thought he was Zorro or what, but he was just an odd, flamboyant guy. And this deal with the royalties began to start to rear its ugly head now that the album was out. And they fired him in August, and their distrust of him proved correct because the issues with the royalties were tied up in court till the very late 80s. When they fired him, they made Bill Thompson their interim manager. There was one other change coming, and Matthew Cates, one of his last things that he set up was a Midwest tour. It was a booking in Chicago at Mother Blues, and unfortunately for Signe, who was pregnant at the time, the accommodations were deplorable. There was no air conditioning, and she had a baby. It was sweltering heat. So Signe had had enough of life on the road, and she told Bill Thompson that she quit. The family pressures just didn't work on the road for her. So Bill Thompson offered her a raise and said, just help us get through these next several shows. They had some media dates in Los Angeles, so she relented and stayed with the band. One of the major appearances they had in LA was at the Whiskey A Go-Go, where they were going to be playing live in front of a lot of critics, and it was coinciding with the release of the new album. The reviews were mixed, and this was kind of the beginning in the rock culture anyway of the Los Angeles versus San Francisco battle. As the reputation grew, they were invited to the Monterey Jazz Festival in September of 1966, and they shared a bill with the Cannonball Adderley Quintet, Muddy Waters, and the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. Rock music was still looked down upon by jazz musicians, but this was a big step for them, and they started to get respect outside of rock circles. And there was one other change coming, and everybody knew it was coming, and that was getting rid of Signe. They had pleaded with her to stay, but at this point, they fired her because one of the things was that her husband was a pain to the band. He was involved with the band a little bit, and he was always offering advice when it wasn't asked for, so they couldn't stand him. And, she had already made it clear that the road was not for her, so it wasn't really working out for either. To say she quit is true, to say she got fired is also true. The time was ripe for the perfect replacement, which was Grace Slick. Now, in an interview not long before Marty Balin passed away, he said that they actually auditioned Carol Doda, a famous topless dancer from San Francisco, but said that she couldn't sing very well. So I thought that was worth mentioning because I had never heard that. So this, with Grace Slick joining the band, this solidified what is known as the classic Jefferson Airplane lineup. Now, Grace Slick was the lead singer of the Great Society, and she became available because the Great Society was breaking up. They were falling apart. And Slick had a considerable reputation on the music scene, not only for her powerful voice, but for her good looks as well. She was very attractive, and she had attended the very first Jefferson Airplane show at the Matrix. The band, The Great Society, was inspired by Jefferson Airplane's first show, and they were one of the up-and-coming bands. But they just couldn't make it. They weren't as talented as the Airplane. And after nonchalantly offering her a spot in the band, this is Jack Cassidy, Grace Slick very happily joined. Having bought Grace Slick out of her contract with Great Society for only $750, Grace began to rehearse with the band. Her first several shows, she wasn't doing a lot of lead vocals. She was just kind of getting used to the band and trying to fit in. And she was tentative, but she warmed up soon after that and started to really contribute. The addition of Grace Slick made her the immediate focal point of Jefferson Airplane. Prior to that, they didn't really have a singer or a leader, visually anyway. You had three front singers in Cantner, Signe Anderson, and Marty Balin, but you didn't have one standout person. Grace Slick was a standout person, and as a formal model, she had the look, style, and the attitude to command the attention of any audience. So this was a great move for both. She had modeled high fashion dresses at I. Magnin in San Francisco. The high society clientele that she worked for, she developed a really good sense of fashion, which she brought to the band as well. Not only did she bring fashion and some sex appeal to the band, she also brought with her two very good songs. Someone to Love, as done by the Great Society, was written by Grace's brother-in-law, Darby Slick, and it was released as a single but didn't do much. But when brought to the Airplane, along with White Rabbit, which was written by Grace, these songs were transformed into something very special. And those two songs would be the foundation for their next album, which would be their breakthrough. And we're going to go into that on part 2 here on Pop Goes the 60s.